I want to start with a couple of questions, and this is going to require some audience participation, so if you'll help me out, that would be great. So how many people here drink beer or wine? All right, and leave your hands up if you are, on the whole, pretty darn satisfied with the beer and wine choices that you have. Me too. Okay, we'll start over. How many of you here vote? And keep your hands up if you are pretty darn satisfied with the products coming to you from the politics industry, be they politicians or policies. And essentially, that is why we're here, because there were only a few hands up. It begs the question, why in America do we have over 6,000 breweries and over 3,000 wineries, and yet when it comes to our politics, we can choose between unsatisfactory choice A and unsatisfactory choice B? And the answer is that unlike the beer and wine industries and so many other consumer industries, in the politics industry, we don't have healthy competition. We don't have so much innovation. We don't have so much accountability to the citizens. We don't have the best of what could be considered free market politics in the best sense of what that can deliver. So a summary of our presentation today might be called, actually, How to Make Our Politics as Satisfying as Our Alcohol. There is, or almost, maybe we'll get there, there is so much talk all the time about the dysfunction and divides in our country. So I'd like to start with something about which we probably all agree, most of us. Washington is broken. We actually say it all the time. But as a good friend of mine, former Congressman Mickey Edwards, originally brought to my attention, this statement actually represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem. In fact, it turns out Washington isn't broken. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do. So how can our political system be so perfectly designed and yet deliver such dismal results? Well, the answer is it's not actually designed for us. The system we have today is not one that's enshrined in our Constitution. The system today has, in fact, been designed, optimized, fine-tuned over time by and for the benefit of private gain-seeking organizations. These are two major political parties and their industry allies, what together comprise a duopoly. We call it the political industrial complex. And the needs of the political industrial complex are not exactly aligned with the needs of the citizens or the public interest. That structure has created a huge problem, which I'm going to illustrate with a Venn diagram, which is going to come up. Here we go. Okay, so currently in our system, if you can see this, there is no intersection, no connection between our elected officials acting in the public interest and the likelihood of their getting reelected, which essentially says, if America's elected representatives do their jobs the way we want and need them to, they're actually likely to lose those jobs. And that's a crazy design, but fortunately it's also optional. We can change the design, and those solutions are what today is about. So in 2016, I asked Michael to join me on a new approach to fixing our politics, using the tools of competition thinking and industry structure that Michael had originally developed at Harvard Business School and have now been the gold standard for decades to understand how industries in the for-profit world work. And rather shockingly, it turns out that using these tools to look at politics sheds new light on our problems, because in many ways, politics is now a huge industry, and it functions not dissimilarly to other industries. Our political problems are not due to one single cause, but rather to a failure of the nature of political competition that has been created. This is a systems problem. The purpose of our work is very simple. We wanted to figure out what would it take to change the system powerfully enough to change the results that the system regularly delivers for the country. And the most powerful solutions center around the very foundation of our democracy, how we vote. The political innovations that we'll recommend today will break partisan gridlock and incent Congress to develop solutions and implement them on behalf of the entire country. Please know that when we talk today, it's about politics, but it's not political. So Michael's a Massachusetts Republican. I have been everything from a Republican to a Libertarian to a Democrat, and now I'm a politically homeless centrist independent. You can join me if you'd like. The problem is not, you'll hear a lot about the parties, but the problem is not the parties per se. And it's also not the Democrats or the Republicans. The problem is the system. So I want to turn it over to Michael, who's going to come up and get us on the same page about what's at stake, and then I'll be back to talk about why it's all screwed up, who's to blame, but most importantly, how we can fix it.
Well, thank you, Katherine, and I hope every one of you can hear us all right, and I'll speak as loudly as I can. There's a little competing nature out there. But we're so happy you're all here, and I truly hope this does not ruin your day. But we got to deal with this. We got to take this on, and the number one thing is we have to understand what's happening here. Almost nobody does. It's taken years for us to kind of get to the bottom of this, and I think we're now in a position to do something about it, but to do something about it, we have to know what to do. And wishing is not the answer. So for me, I'm a HBS professor, as Linda said. I work on competition and strategy and competitiveness and economic development. And I can tell you that politics was literally the last thing I ever thought I would work on or would be interested in working on. But that changed, and that changed starting in about 2010, a number of years ago now, when I became the co-chair of a major project we did at Harvard Business School on the competitiveness of the United States economy. Because what we were seeing in those days, which was that the US economy was performing in a way that was really disturbing. For decades and decades and decades, we'd achieved this levels of growth and this levels of improvement in income and this levels of improvement in all kinds of things. And all of a sudden that stopped. And it actually stopped before the Great Recession hit. It was already trending in the wrong direction. And we were very puzzled and concerned and wanted to try to see if we could figure out what was the root cause here, what was going on. So we set out to take a look at US competitiveness and try to identify what was wrong and what we needed to do. And as we did that, we started to see that there was something very, very deep happening that at least I hadn't understood, but Katherine helped me understand. Now, this is going to be hard to read. I wish we had bigger slides, and if anybody wants any of these slides, you can get them. We will get you websites and access to any of this material. This is a busy slide that does sort of a competitive assessment of the United States economy. A very HBS 2x2 matrix. We love these. And what you see is strengths on the right and up. These are areas where the US is strong economically, based on all of our research and our surveys of our alumni. On the left are weaknesses. The ones that are improving, weaknesses that are getting better, are in the upper left. And of course, there's nothing there. And the weaknesses that are getting worse are in the lower left, okay? So when we look at this slide, what do we conclude? Well, the first thing we conclude is actually really good. We have in America, we have tremendous economic strengths that we've managed to retain. I'll read them for you. Entrepreneurship, we're very good at entrepreneurship, better than anybody in the world still. We have actually high quality of management by all kinds of metrics. We have great universities. We're slightly biased at Harvard on that. We have very, very deep capital markets that are able to finance a lot of risky stuff at scale. We have a really good innovation environment. And we really protect property rights. We have the concentrations of world-class companies like we have here in Boston and software and other areas like that. We have a lot of strengths. But we also have developed some very significant weaknesses that are actually getting worse. So let me just take you through some of those. Number one, we have an education system, K through 12, that's actually still getting worse compared to other places in the world. Not so good. We have inadequate skills in our workforce. We used to have the most skilled workers in the world in America. Now we don't. Now we're sinking on the list. Many American companies go overseas to get skilled workers these days. We have poor infrastructure. We've been talking about that for years. We have very complex regulation, maybe a few little changes lately, but still very complicated, very costly to deal with regulation in this country. Not that regulation is bad, but just the way we do it could be better. We have a very high-cost legal system that we subject everybody to have to live with. We have a very high-cost healthcare system, by far the highest cost in the world, yet we don't get better health, and more. And these weaknesses, as strong as our strengths are, have led to not only this weakening in the overall economy, but also rising inequality. You can see the things that would reinforce inequality, like education, skills, and so forth, health. Those are weaknesses. So that's worked against our ability to have everybody do well. And increasingly, we have a bigger and bigger divide among our citizens. We also found that too many Americans don't actually even earn a living wage, despite the fact that we're, the most advanced economy in the world, or at least that's the way we think of ourselves. We also have a situation now where workforce participation, which is the proportion of working-age people that's in the economy actually working, is at a 40-year low. We worked our way up to getting a lot of people engaged in our economy. That was one of our great strengths in this country, but now we're kind of sinking. More and more people are not really participating, and certainly not participating the way they want to. We believe that unemployment today is still over 10%. It's nowhere near 3.7 or whatever the government is telling us every day. Because the way it's counting unemployment is missing a lot of people that really aren't participating, that aren't really taking advantage of being an American like many of the rest of us are. Now, if you look at that assessment, I guess the first thing I would say is, it's a mixed assessment. We got some good things, but we got some pretty bad things. But let's look at who's responsible for those areas. And if you look at this chart, and you look at the strengths that I went through, and you say, okay, whose job is that? I think what we would say is almost all of that is in the private sector. If we look at all the weaknesses, legal system, macro policy, logistics infrastructure, healthcare, whose responsibility is that? And almost every single one of these things is the responsibility of government. And what we're seeing is that somehow government isn't functioning the way it needs to function. We're not getting most things done that we need to do. We at HBS, after this work, we put together what we called our 8-point plan. It was the 8 things that we need to do to really restore our economic vitality. I, with my colleagues, went to Washington, 15 times, 10 times, I can't remember how many, talked to so many members of Congress. And every one of them, we presented our recommendation, our diagnosis. You know what they all said? Yeah, we agree. That's exactly right. This is exactly what's wrong, and this is exactly what we need to do. The problem, and this was my shock therapy, the problem was that we have gotten nothing done. If you look at our significant problems in this country, we've made no real progress on any of them, with very small and very narrow exceptions, in the last 3 or 4 decades. decades. We still can't get our act together to fix infrastructure. We still can't fix the public schools. We can't deal with these. We're just not dealing with any of these issues. We're stuck. And that's pretty bad news. But actually, it's even worse than that. It's worse than that because economics is just half of the job of government. The government also has to be responsible for and hopefully advance our quality of life. You know, our social conditions, our environmental conditions. Now, in that area, America has always thought of itself as a leader. You know, we invented universal public education in this country. We did a lot of social innovation over the course of this country's history, but actually we had no way of measuring where we stood today and what was going on now. So I led a team that developed something called the Social Progress Index. It's relatively new. You can find it on the web. What it does is it benchmarks virtually every country in the world on the social quality of life environmental agenda using the best available objective data. Okay, so we could finally say, how are we doing in America? And the answer is not so good. Not so good. So this just takes a few of the many, many measures that we have available now to compare ourselves and just gives you some examples of where do we rank among advanced economies. And it turns out that there's the number of advanced economies is only about 35 in the world. And that's stretching it a little bit. It's even less. And what do you see here? You know, access to quality education. So we're now down to 32nd. We're like in the basement of all the advanced economies in terms of our education system. It's been getting that way for a long time, but that's where we are today. Maternal mortality, child mortality, 34 and 32. I mean, this is like a third world country. This is the United States of America. And look at where we've sunk. Homicide rate, traffic deaths. This is one of the most unsafe countries in the world right now. Certainly way up there among any advanced economy that we would all think is anywhere near a peer to ours. There's more. There's lots more. And we're finding that there are problems with political rights. There's problem with discrimination against minorities and violence against minorities. We're sinking there. We were the land of the free. We were the place that came together. I mean, we've let that get away from us. We have problems of safe water. We have problems of ridiculous immigration policy. We've got gun violence. And guess what? It's actually getting worse. As we look at how we're changing, nothing's going up. With very few exceptions, a lot of things are going down. We're failing. We can actually measure how well our government is performing looking at this data. And the answer is really, really bad. Our government is failing us. It's not because of all the political drama. It's not because he said, she said, campaign debates, fighting, all that funny stuff that we watch on TV. That's not the problem that we really should be worrying about. The problem is we're not getting good results. Our government is not delivering what we need it to deliver. And if we can't change that, we're going to keep getting more divided as a nation. Our quality of life is going to keep going down for more and more Americans. And, who knows what America will turn into. One of the great republic that we invented many years ago that was so tremendously important around the world. Well, now we've kind of lost that. And fundamentally, the problem is our government is not functioning, particularly at the federal level. So the question is, what happened? How could this possibly be? How could we be a third world country on our, quality of life and social agenda? How could that happen? And I used to think that it was a policy problem. I'm a policy guy, so I thought, we just don't have good policy. Well, no. We know exactly what the right policy is. That's not the problem. We can't do it. We actually have a political system problem. So this is where Katherine and I come together. This is the problem of our time. This is the problem of our age. I mean, this is a truly the most important thing any of us needs to learn how to deal with. So the question is, how do we get here? What's going on? What's causing the gridlock? What's causing the lack of progress? Why isn't our government able to function? Let me turn it back over to Katherine to kind of give you some insight into why that's happening.
Thank you, Michael. So I want to go back to what I said before. Washington isn't broken. It's doing what it's designed to do. It's designed by and for the benefit of the political industrial complex, not for voters, not for citizens, not for the public interest. So I'd like to take a peek under the proverbial hood, and when we do that, we discover that there are a lot of things in politics that have been kind of invisible to us, and it doesn't work the way most of us have assumed. So there's a couple of examples. So go back to 2009 when Joe Biden became vice president. His Senate seat was then open in Delaware, and I'm told that everybody in Delaware knew who was going to be the next senator from the state of Delaware, and it was a multiple-term governor and congressman, the most popular politician in the state, Mike Castle. So, next step, Mike Castle ran in his Republican primary, and he lost. Now, this was really shocking, but not theoretically a big problem, because after all, that was just the primary. Mike Castle could theoretically put himself on the general election ballot in November as an independent, and he would have won. Of course, none of us have heard of a Senator Mike Castle, because he had a slight problem. Delaware has a law, and it's called the sore loser law. And what that says is, if you run in your party's primary, Democrat or Republican, and you lose, you are not permitted by law to have your name on the general election ballot in November. Fitness, popularity, experience, it's all immaterial. What we need to ask is, how many states? How many states have a crazy, undemocratic law like that? And the answer is 44. And we're sitting in one today. Now, there are a few other things that we have to all understand and contemplate about partisan primaries. So they may be publicly funded, but if you think about it, they're really selection processes for the standard bearer of a private organization. And primaries are the main reason why so many people come to the general election and think, gosh, I really don't love these choices that I have. Because it turns out that most elections are actually decided in the primary, especially in gerrymandered districts. And voters who turn out for partisan primaries tend to be more ideological than the electorate as a whole, and therefore to make it through the primary, candidates have to go further to the right and the left than voters as a whole really want. But even more alarming than the effect that primaries have on the election process is that they corrupt. The influence of the partisan primary extends to corrupt actual governing. Let's see how that works. Imagine yourself as a politician, and now you're in Washington, D.C., and you have an opportunity to vote yes on a bipartisan compromise landmark piece of legislation, perhaps to solve one of those biggest problems that Michael talked about. Questions that you might want to ask would include, is this a good idea? Is this the right policy for the country? Or perhaps, is this what the majority of the constituents in my district want? But it's actually none of those. The question that you ask is, will I make it back through my partisan primary if I vote for this? And if the answer to that is no, and on the hard issues, it virtually always is, then the rational incentive to get reelected dictates that you vote no. Now, occasionally, duty, principle might overcome you and you decide to vote yes anyway in opposition to your side of the political industrial complex. So then what happens? Well, you'll be threatened with a primary. So as you may have noticed, primary ceased some years ago to be a noun only. It has become an action verb, as in, we're going to primary you. And what that means is we're going to run someone further to your right if you're a Republican, further to your left if you're a Democrat. Never has it meant we're going to run a more consensus-oriented candidate to the middle. Partisan primaries combined with partisan gerrymandering are two key tools that the duopoly uses to control the political process. And they effectively force our elected officials, both right and left. And this makes it very difficult to get anything done. So now let's consider a second example of our partisan system. And this one isn't from elections, it's from actual governing. The duopoly also perverts governance by controlling what we call the legislative machinery, and that's our word for the norms, rules, and practices that govern how legislators go about passing laws. The Hastert rule is one of these pieces of legislative machinery, and it's a particularly egregious example of party control taking precedence over the legislature's ability to work collectively even when the country wants it, and I'll describe it for you. The Hastert rule has become a well-accepted practice of the Speaker of the House. All speakers, Democrats and Republicans. What it says is the Speaker is not going to allow a floor vote in Congress, in the House, on legislation unless that legislation is supported by a majority of the majority, which is to say, of the Speaker's party. So they do that even if a majority of the House would vote to pass it. Unless speakers ignore this practice, which they do from time to time, but rarely, legislation supported by the majority of the country or a majority of the House oftentimes has absolutely no chance of ever passing because there'll never even be a vote in our democracy. There are real-life consequences to this, many, but let's go to one in 2013. So you remember that shutdown. It turns out that shutdown could have been entirely averted or ended earlier if then Speaker John Boehner had allowed a floor vote on legislation that had already been passed by the Senate and that was supported by a majority of the House, which is to say, virtually all of the Democrats plus a minority of Republicans. And the shutdown, in fact, ended only when Speaker John Boehner broke with his party and broke the Hastert rule to allow the vote. So effectively, this completely made-up rule, the Hastert rule, cements majority party control in a legislature that is supposed to represent the interests of all U.S. citizens. And it cost the country $24 billion in a 16-day shutdown that 90% of the American public didn't want from the start. So if you think about it in the context of all of the organizations where you work, I suspect if you wanted to solve your biggest problems, one thing you might not be likely to do is get everybody together in a room like this and then say, okay, but before we get started, let's count off by twos, and then we'll divide into warring teams and get straight to work. But literally, that's how it is every day in Washington, D.C. Our founders warned against political parties, as when John Adams said, "There is nothing which I fear so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other." Clearly, it's not exactly Schoolhouse Rock out there, which is what taught me a long time ago how government works. But not so much you guys, because that was a joke. My daughter has a better joke. I'm going to recover with this one. So if con is the opposite of pro, then isn't Congress the opposite of progress? She's better than I am. All right. Okay. In the duopoly, the players advance their own interests instead of the public interest. But what's unique about the politics industry as compared to any other industry like the wine and beer industries is that there's no independent regulation. The actors in the politics industry are the ones that themselves control the rules of the game. So many of us mistakenly think that the rules of the game are all set in the Constitution, but it's not true. It turns out that most of the rules that have the most power governing the incentives that drive day-to-day behavior in legislating are set by the political industrial complex and for their benefit. So for example, you've all heard of the pocket constitution, and here's mine. I had to get this so I had pockets big enough. This is mine. And in here, there are 6 tiny paragraphs that govern how the House and the Senate should work. And this is the House Rules Book. This is 1,500 pages of legislative machinery. And without even reading it, and I haven't and I won't, I can tell you what's not in here is best practices of problem solving. It's really a document made up to divide the spoils of power. So I'm going to set it right over here on top of the Senate Rules Book. And we can just contemplate that for the rest of the day because it will motivate us for solutions. As is always the case in life, in our lives, in Congress, in our industries, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played. And the net result of the rules of the game in politics is unhealthy competition. Unhealthy competition in elections, and again, unhealthy competition in legislating. And the result of unhealthy competition in any industry is always that customers are not well served. So thus, we have a situation where the actors in the politics industry are thriving, and yet the American public has simply never been more dissatisfied. So just last fall, a new poll came out showing that 61% of Americans think a new major third party is needed. And the percentage of Americans self-identifying as independents is at an all-time high of 46%. And those identifying as Republicans, 27 and 26 for Democrats. In any other industry, this large, with this much power, and thriving, with this much customer dissatisfaction, we would see a new competitor, an entrepreneur who says, I'm going to come into this marketplace and break it up and deliver what customers want. But that doesn't happen in the politics industry, because it turns out that the duopoly works very well together in one particular way, and that is to rig the rules of the game to protect themselves jointly from new competition. Said another way, politics isn't broken, it's fixed. Okay, thank you. All right. I just tell myself, wait for it, maybe it's coming. All right. This looks like a promising antitrust case. Like, we give this speech a lot at Harvard Business School, and if I don't say this part, someone comes up and say, let's file an antitrust lawsuit. But here's the thing, ever so conveniently, antitrust regulation does not apply to the politics industry. And troublingly, there's no accountability for any of this. There's no accountability because the customer only has 2 choices. The only thing either party has to do to convince to win is to convince the average voter to choose them as the lesser of 2 evils, or convince the average voter to choose them because at least they say they're for what that voter believes. But one thing that neither side has to do in this competition is actually deliver results. Because no matter how disappointed you are, you still likely prefer what your side says therefore than what the one other choice says therefore. So instead of results in the public interest, we get gridlock. This slide shows the percentage of salient, important issues that are deadlocked in Congress, and there's been a relentless increase from 1947 to today. We had a high watermark of 74% in 2014. And when we do get something done, it's partisan. So here, we see a striking and troubling implication of the industry structure, which is to say that landmark legislation used to pass with bipartisan support. So starting on the right, you'll see the combination of red and blue votes for, let's see if I can read it, Social Security, highways, Medicare, and welfare reform. And then things changed. We see all blue for health care and Dodd-Frank, and all red for tax cuts. Today, important legislation passes only on party lines. And then when the other party retakes power, they focus not on improving, but on repealing. This happens in part because we simply don't have enough moderates left who can bridge the gap between the two sides. This slide shows the decline in moderates over time. And everyone knows it's broken. Here we see a dramatic decline in public trust in the federal government from 1958 to 2017. Now, if the competition in the politics industry were healthy, industry actors would be competing to advance the public interest, and they would be held accountable for that. But we know they're not. And the question is, what's wrong in this industry? And for that, I give it to Michael. I'll be back with solutions.
Thank you. I need that. Okay, so now let's kind of burrow down a little bit deeper into this industry and see if we can understand what's really the root causes of this. Katherine has given us a big headline, which is it's the rules the parties have created. But let's get deeper into that because we have to understand all of those rules or many of those rules if we're going to do anything about this, okay? So you see here on this slide a picture of what's usually called the 5 forces. And if you're a business school student, you've been probably compelled, to memorize this. If you're not, you may not have seen it before. But what this is a way of understanding what is driving competition in any industry. It's a tool that can be used in any business. You can use it for cars or airplanes or any other industry. But it had never really been applied to politics because we thought of politics as sort of a public institution. It's not like an industry. Well, it is. It's a gigantic industry. Billions and billions and billions of dollars of revenue every year. Money pouring in. Influence and power, stacking up. This is an industry, and it behaves like an industry. And to understand it, we can look at it the same way. Now, at the center of any industry structure is rivalry. It's the way in which the rivals actually compete. The rivals are the competitors, Coke versus Pepsi. In this case, it's the Democrats versus the Republicans. Those are the rivals, and what Katherine has really highlighted is the way those rivals are choosing to compete with each other and how is really critical here to understand. Because it's that choice that is not to get things done and move this country forward. They're competing in a different way, very successfully for them. Now, in terms of the rivalry we have in this industry, this is an unusual industry, it's called a duopoly. A duopoly is an industry where there's only 2 competitors. No more. They dominate. There's not all that many duopolies out there. Usually there's more competitors. More competitors are good. But if you only have 2, then that really is going to shape how these players can actually compete with each other. First of all, when you have just two dominant competitors, they don't want to compete head-to-head. They're both very powerful, and they know that if they go head-to-head, try to do the same thing, they're going to beat each other up and probably not maximize the quality of life for them. They want to avoid head-to-head. Katherine has always said, in this industry, the customer, and that's us, we'll talk about customers in a minute, we only have two choices. It's very rare. Usually we have more than two choices, like for beer or for wine. But when you only have two choices, and those two choices are different choices, they're not similar choices, they're different choices, that gives both parties a lot of freedom in terms of how they structure the game that they're playing. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. The final thing about a duopoly that's really, really important to understand is when you only have two, and they know who each other are, and they're very powerful, there's a tremendous pressure and incentive for them to cooperate, not just compete. Because they're both so big that if they can make the whole business better for both of them, that's a good investment. Anything they can do to make the industry better for both of them is worth doing in this industry because there's only two. So let's talk a little bit about how they've chosen then to do that competing. And the first point is that we believe that the customer here, we should think of the customers as us. We're the citizens. We're the ones who this industry ought to be delivering value to. Okay? How do the parties think about competitors? Well, I think the most important thing to understand is they're not trying to serve the average voter. They're not competing for the middle. Why? Because that would be a destructive type competition where they could hurt each other. Instead, what they've decided to do is what any really smart business person would do that shouldn't be compared to this, because this is like one of the worst things that's ever happened to us. What they've done is they've said, instead of going head-to-head, instead of competing for the same voters, instead of trying to serve the middle, we're going to divide up the voters. So our party is going to have this group of voters, and the other party will have a mutually exclusive other group of voters. And then there's going to be some stray voters that don't vote or average voters that nobody's going to be trying to serve. They're not going to be in either side's target. And they're just going to be there, getting whatever they can get. Who are the party's target customers? Very few of them are sitting in this room. Their target customers are, number one, and you can guess this, partisan primary voters. The people who show up every time for the partisan primary because they're really into the left or the right, and they're really into the kind of issues that the Democrats are excited about or the Republicans are excited about. So they show up in that primary. And as Katherine said, they're quite partisan. They're more ideological. And by the way, there's not that many of them. It takes a small number of votes to win a primary compared to a general election. So the partisan primary voters are the core target of the party. The other core target is, sadly, special interest. People that have an overwhelming desire for a certain thing to happen that is going to meet their need or make them somehow do better. A special interest could be business. It could be an industry. The opioid industry, trying to get the rules set and the legislation set to make their life possible. Well, they succeeded big time. They got all kinds of avoidance of rules in the opioid industry, and that's one of the reasons why we had the disaster. And they did that by actually being served by parties. The parties also focus, special interest also can be on social type issues. People that really care about, choice or whatever, abortion, whatever the social issue is, those people are divided up depending on whose ideology they're more aligned with. So the people more on the left side issues are in the target market for the Democrats. The folks on the right side, in terms of the way they think about ideology and issues, are in the customer group for the Republican side. So we have the parties have divided the voters, not gone head to head. And anybody that's not one of their core voters doesn't matter. They pay virtually no attention, and they don't try to deliver. But for their core customers, their job is to deliver value to them, because they know that if they can, those voters are the most attractive. They're reliable, they give a lot of money, you can count on them to be on your side, forever. That's how they've structured this. And frankly, relatively few of us in this room are in the party's target customer set. And that's one of the reasons why we have the kind of legislative solutions that we have. So that's kind of the first thing we have to understand. Now, let's talk about, you can see under customers, there's other customers out there, but the target customers are the ones I described. Another part of the industry is what we call the channels. These are the ways in which the parties reach the customer, reach the voter. And you hopefully, I don't know if you can read that, but that's direct voter engagement, the ground game, advertising, paid advertising, the media, used to be called independent media. We'll come to that in a minute. The social media, a whole new channel has risen up, which could have been a great way of informing the public, but it's not turned out that way. It's turned out to be a great way for dividing the public. But again, that's the whole game here. It's about dividing. It's not about connecting. It's not about integrating. It's not about serving. It's about dividing. That's the way they win. And they're very good at it. So the channels, the direct voter engagement, the advertising, the media, those used to be pretty neutral. What's happened to the industry is the channels now have been captured by the parties. So the parties kind of divide up the channels. Some of the electronic media is on the left, some of the electronic media is on the right. You've all seen, you know who I'm talking about, but it's not like the channels are covering both parties and serving both parties. The channels are very much about this side versus that side. And that's how it works. And the channels like it because they do better that way. This has been a boom for television, this political division, this drama. So the channels are falling in line, and that's reinforced the way the parties compete. On the other side of this chart is the suppliers. These are the things that parties need to run elections, to govern. You see the list there. They need candidates that will run. They need campaign talent to run the election, the pollsters, campaign managers, all that stuff. Voter data. Data is very important in today's political competition. Think tanks to come up with the ideas and write the legislation, and then lobbyists to go market it, to all the relevant players. Again, traditionally, suppliers were kind of neutral. Here, the parties have divided up the suppliers. So you're either campaign staff on the left or campaign staff on the right. You're either a voter data firm on the left, voter data firm on the right. You're either a think tank now that's on the left or a think tank on the right, and so on. Now, imagine what that does to somebody wanting to run as an independent. Just spend a moment pondering that. An independent can't find a channel. An independent can't find a campaign manager. And that's some of the barriers to entry that we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. Essentially, all this does is just amplify the division. You have really two camps that are just bitter. Everybody on the team is against the team on the other side, and they spend every waking hour trying to be as clever as possible to capture as many of those voters in the core core target group as they can. And they're pretty darn good at it. Another really critical thing about this competition is the high barriers to entry. You see there, a new entrant is a new party. Some of you here that are historically oriented, you might know that we haven't had a new party in this country that actually mattered in any way, shape, or form for well over 100 years. We have lots of people that try, but they often never even elect anybody to anything significant. That's been true for a long time. The Greens and all, they never elected a significant public official in any election. Even though they're always there and they're always on the ballot, it doesn't work. So new entrants are not showing up. Why? We always know that when there's not new entrants, there's barriers to entry. And what are those in this industry? Well, number one, there's scale. If you're going to be running hundreds of elections all across the country and you have all the infrastructure and all the voter lists and all the data and the analytics, you can do it a lot more efficiently than some new rival, some new party trying to break into the industry. New parties just don't get anywhere. They don't have the resources, they don't have the scale, they don't have the efficiency to do so. And therefore, it's not a surprise that we don't see new competitors. Some of the rules that raise the barriers to entry, Katherine has already mentioned, and there's one she didn't mention, but the parties collude to set the rules for how you compete, what it would take to get in the election, what it would take to win the election. And they don't set those rules fairly. They set them so that they will win. Here's an example, fundraising rules. These are fundraising rules set by the parties for election fundraising. And it turns out that a single donor can contribute $847,500 per year to a Democratic candidate or a Republican candidate. But if you want to contribute to an independent candidate, you can only contribute $5,400 every 2-year election cycle. So that's 313 times less than a party candidate can get. This is a made-up rule. The parties agreed on this rule. Yeah, we like this rule. We want to make it really, you can give a lot of money, but you can't give those guys anything. And the other guys don't get anywhere. So barriers to entry are critical here. And then there's the substitute. A substitute is a competitor that's not a direct competitor. A substitute is a disruptor, like Uber versus the taxi industry. So again, given the horrendous results and the dissatisfied public, why don't we have disruptors here? And the answer is, unfortunately, the rules apply to the disruptor too. You just can't change the way the election works. You can't change any of these rules. The rules are set. The disruptor has to live with them, and they have to deal with the same barriers to entry. So independents, despite the fact that 46% say that they're independents almost never win. Almost never win. So what does all this mean? Let me just kind of pull this together. There's 4 profound implications that come from this competition. The first one is the one that, I kind of freak out every time I even say it. And that is the way the political game is set up today, the parties don't want to solve problems. That's not what they do. Why did both parties kill bipartisan immigration bills? Because they wanted the immigration debate to fester and fester and fester and fester. And that implies to almost everything. If they solve something, rather than competing on ideology and wanting something totally different and never being willing to agree, if they solve something, all of a sudden some of their core supporters say, oh, okay, I'm not going to support the party anymore. I don't need to. I got what I wanted. But in most cases, they don't want that. They don't want to solve anything. They simply want to be consistent with their ideology. And one of the things that I hope all of you know is ideology never solves anything. It's too simplistic. It's a cartoon of the real world. To solve a problem, you can't just take the ideological solution. It's not big government versus small government. That's ideology, but that's useless. It doesn't tell you anything. What we want is a system. If we're going to have good government, we need a little bit of big and a little bit of small, and we need to structure it the right way, and that's complicated. We need to make sausage. We need to combine points of view, and multiple ideologies have to come together to do anything that really works. So the parties are not set up to do that. They don't want to do that. It irritates their most important customers, and they don't want to solve problems. And they'd much rather preserve their ideology than solving any problem. A second, what I would call horrifying implication of this industry is political division is not just in the legislative process anymore. We now have political division in our executive branch of government. We used to have a lot of civil servants doing the important roles in government, in the executive branch. And now they've been almost universally replaced with, guess what? Political appointees, particularly the big jobs. So these are people that are appointed because of their loyalty and commitment and partisanship to whichever party appointed them. Okay, so all of a sudden they're much more worried about partisanship as well and ideology as well. What else has been corrupted by the parties? Well, number two is the issue of our regulatory agencies. We have a whole branch of government that's about regulation: Federal Trade Commission, antitrust, Food and Drug Administration, drug safety, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Traditionally, the people who ran those agencies were the best qualified people. They were independent. They were well equipped with experience. Now, to be an agency head in the United States of America, the number one qualification is you're a trusted, loyal partisan for whatever side has control over that appointment. So now the regulatory agencies are highly partisan. If you know the right people, you can get your merger through the FTC by taking advantage of those political connections if you're connected on that side. Whereas in the old days, the FTC would say, oh, that merger's anti-competitive. We're going to reject that. Well, that doesn't happen nearly as much anymore. The third thing that the parties have taken over that we don't really understand, or most of us don't understand, is actually our courts. Again, traditionally, if you look in history, we used to go through an American Bar Association review. People that were potential judges would have to be qualified and certified as, you're qualified to be a judge. And then the process would be to appoint the qualified judges to the open spots. Doesn't work that way today. Today, the judge nomination process, as we've seen personally, all of us, is heavily, heavily partisan. To get on the Supreme Court, if the Republicans are the ones doing the nominating, you got to be a very loyal Republican. And the same is true on the left, on the Democratic side. That's not the idea of what a court is. A court is dispassionate, even-handed, figures out, what the right answer is for society. But the courts have not been set up that way. And now we have very few votes that are not party line votes in the Supreme Court. And it didn't used to be that way. We used to have a lot of unanimous votes. All the justices would come together around the problem. So again, you can see there's a theme here. There's an insight here that these people had about how to set up a government to work for them and how not to work for us. And they're definitely succeeding at that. Final thing I would say is, and since I'm a business professor, I want to say this. Business community has made it worse by the way that business has been participating in politics. Too much lobbying, trying to influence the legislation in the favor of our industry or our interests. Too much money on ballot initiatives companies are often the biggest spender on ballot initiatives where the citizens are supposedly deciding an issue. And the companies just buy the win. We see that in Massachusetts as well as elsewhere in the country. And I can tell you story after story of how the industry has taken over and determined the policy, and this includes opioids. It was ballot initiatives that allowed opioids to actually become a huge problem in this country that were defeated by the businesses that were lobbying for that side. In business, we're hiring former government officials. We're spending money on elections. We're trying to influence our employees about who they should vote for, and so on and so on and so on. So I want to say that we in business, or associated with business, we've got to change our game. Because right now we're just making the party game worse. And by the way, business is funding a lot of the political industrial complex. And the final thing that probably most of you know this already from listening to us, there are no countervailing forces that are going to change any of this. There's no natural force that's going to fix this. If we're going to fix it, we're going to have to fix it ourselves. The parties are not going to fix it. It's working for them. There's no legal reason why it's going to get fixed. We have to fix it. And now to perhaps the most important part of what we want to share with you today is, let me ask Katherine to come up and tell us, what we have to do to actually fix this. It's not easy, but we can do it.
Okay. Thank you. We are over time. Here goes a good part of my speech, but if you can stay, because this is the solutions, and I will do my best to get you through it quickly. It's quite exciting, actually. So let's summarize the theory of change. In any game, boards game, sports games, serious games like politics, the rules of the game affect the way the game is played and affect the outcome of the game. So you can change the rules in basketball and get a faster game or a slower game. You put a three-point line in and the whole game changes. And you can change the rules of the game in any industry and get different behavior. And remember, most of the rules in the industry of politics are not in the Constitution. They've been invented, and they've been invented badly. The problem, as we said before, is that those rules have been made up to serve partisans and not to solve problems. So to transform the system, we have to re-engineer the rules of the game to incent healthy competition on dimensions that matter to the public interest. And it's both that simple and that hard. What we need is political innovation. We have many exciting things to talk about, but today I am going to focus on one political innovation that is the single most powerful thing that we as citizens can do to alter the results coming from our politics, and that is to transform the elections machinery, to change how we vote. So I'm going to back up for a moment and review the two critical structural problems that we're combating in our elections. The first is the partisan primaries that I already talked about. So remember, this creates an eye of the needle through which I often say no problem-solving politician can pass. So we're going to have to change that. And the second problem we have is that we have plurality winners in all of our elections in the US. Now, this is something we never think about, so let me review that. In the US, elections can be won with the most votes, but not necessarily a true majority. So for example, in a three-way race, one candidate could win with 34% of the votes, which means also that 66% of the voters preferred someone else, the other two candidates. And believe it or not, that existence of plurality winners is an enormous barrier to new competition because it creates the spoiler problem. And the spoiler argument is what's happening when we sometimes don't vote for the candidate we really want out of the fear that we will inadvertently contribute to the election of the candidate we like the least. For example, in 2016, You can't vote for Jill Stein because you'll take votes away from Hillary and spoil the election for her and accidentally help elect Donald Trump. And you cannot, on the other side, vote for Gary Johnson, the libertarian, because you will take votes away from Donald Trump, spoil the election for him, and accidentally help elect Hillary. The spoiler argument is wielded against every potential new competitor to the duopoly. It's the single greatest reason why we don't have healthy competition, because most potential new competitors, unlike Jill Stein and Gary Johnson, don't even make it to the starting line because they know they can't get past the spoiler argument. We just saw it happen with Howard Schultz, the former CEO of Starbucks, who considered an independent centrist run for president. And whether or not you would have wanted him to be your president, it's interesting to note that the spoiler argument forced out of the race a serious, qualified contender that we might have benefited from hearing from. If you think about it, politics is the only industry where we are regularly told that less competition is better for the consumer. The election innovation that we propose, it's called Top 5 RCV, solves both of these problems. And it's going to fundamentally change what politicians are incented to do and, importantly, our ability to hold them accountable, not for what they say, but for the results they deliver or don't. Top 5 RCV, so that's the elections innovation, requires 2 key changes, one in the primary and one in the general. So the first thing we do is we change to top 5 primaries. Here's how it works. We eliminate partisan primaries where you vote in the Democrat primary or the Republican primary. Instead, when you vote, there's one ballot, one primary, it's open, and every candidate, no matter their party, Libertarian, Democrat, Republican, Green, Independent, is all on that same ballot. You vote. And from that primary, the top 5 finishers advance to the general election. That's why it's called an open top 5 primary. Top 5 primaries obliterate the eye of the needle problem in the primary and therefore allow legislators significantly more leeway to act in the public interest. The second thing we have to do is in the general election. We will change from plurality voting, plurality winners, to ranked choice voting. And here's how that works. The top 5 finishers from the single primary are now on the ballot. So now when I go to vote, I pick my favorite, just like always. But then if I want to, I can also say, oh, this is my second choice, and my third choice, and my fourth and last choices. I can rank as many or as few as I want. And here's a sample ballot in a ranked choice voting election. So for me, I like the musical, so I'm going to pick Alexander Hamilton as my first choice. I'd like to see a woman founder, so I'm picking Abigail Adams. And then the rest of my choices fill out as you see. Now, the polls close. Only every single voter's first place votes are counted. And if, after that, there's a true majority winner, someone has over 50%, well, the election's over, because that candidate won. However, if, after we count everybody's first place votes, no candidate has a true majority over 50%, then the candidate who came in last place is automatically eliminated, and voters who had selected that candidate who's now out will have their second choice vote counted in the next round. So now you count the votes again, and you look for a true majority winner. You keep repeating the process of eliminating whoever is in last until you successfully elect the candidate with the most appeal to the greatest number of voters. It's basically a series of runoffs, but instead of having to keep coming back for another election, you're going to cast all your votes at once. And these are not, by the way, crazy new ideas. So go back to 2002. Alaska had a referendum to implement ranked choice voting in their state. And at that time, we had a famous politician who recorded a robocall supporting ranked choice voting. Let's quickly listen.
Hello, this is Senator John McCain. I'm calling to urge your support for ballot measure 1 on August 27th. As a presidential candidate and as a senator, I've worked hard to open up the political process for all Americans. Ballot measure 1 will adopt a fairer voting method. It will lead to good government because Alaska will elect leaders who have the support of a majority of voters. Please vote yes on measure 1 on August 27th.
And that was 2002. Also in the mainland in 2002, where I live, Illinois, we had Senate Bill 1789 proposing ranked choice voting for all congressional and state primaries. The sponsor, then State Senator Barack Obama. John McCain and Barack Obama, two talented and dedicated public servants who absolutely knew how the game is played. They were ahead of their time on what needs to happen in our system. But now that time has come. So you all have a ballot on your chair. Please fill it out and include your contact information if you want to learn the results of this very exciting election, but also if you want to get more information on the work that we're doing here, because I won't have time to go over all of it today. This powerful political innovation, Top 5 RCV, will powerfully alter incentives. Let's reimagine Congress post-election machinery reform. Because remember, it's about results. Oh, no ballots? Oh, well, technical difficulty. Don't worry, my website will be there. Okay, so now voters, elected officials can actually vote yes when there's a bipartisan bill because they know they can make it through their primary and they can put together first and second place votes in order to be reelected and serve the public interest. And that is truly political innovation and the power of that innovation. Our country was founded on the greatest political innovation of modern times. And political innovation is once again the key to our future. Please join us in passing these innovations in this state of Massachusetts and every state across the country. You can find more information about how to do that, and you can get in touch with us on our website, which is on the last slide, just to show you everything I skipped. It is right here. Thank you so much.